Even now, I find joy in the suffering I endure for you. In my own flesh, I fill up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. This is Colossians chapter 1, verse 24. It causes us to take a look at human suffering. What role does it play in our faith? I don't have a hard and fast answer for this. I went through a period of extreme suffering 3 years ago when I was very seriously ill, lost my leg. It brought me to a new honesty with myself, and it caused me to look carefully at what I can do and what I can't do. But I'm still meditating on the mystery of that time and the mystery of what's happened since then. Why do people suffer? Why do good people suffer? The whole book of Job takes up this question. And this is important to our spirituality as Christians. It's important to precious blood spirituality. Father Schreiter says in chapter 9 of In Water and in Blood, a spirituality of the blood of Christ brings forward the mystery of suffering and death in the symbol of the cross, standing as a sign of the contradictions that mark our existence. Contradictions about what constitute power and weakness, success and failure. The cross serves as a constant reminder of the failure of human goodness, but it also stands as the special place where God has chosen to dwell among inhabitants of the earth. A sign of violence and disintegration of human life, it is also the pledge of a redemption from sin and suffering. Well, what does Paul mean by this passage? It's really problematic, especially since in the last chapter of In Water and in Blood, Paul is saying Christ has the fulfillment that reconciles everything in him. He's the fulfillment. Okay. So how do we work this out? I know there's one school of thought that says we can offer our sufferings up for another. This was introduced to me a few years ago when I was giving a parish mission and having a conversation with the people taking part in the mission. And, okay, I could see that, but I'm not comfortable with it. I would have a hard time thinking that my suffering could help someone else. And I would be very, very put out. I would not be very comfortable at all if someone offered their suffering for my sake. Isn't Christ enough? Well, there's no scholarly consensus on this passage. The question of something lacking in the expiatory sufferings of Christ was not even raised until the time of Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century. And he said, no, there was nothing lacking in the sufferings of Christ. One thing that might help us is that Paul uses a different word for suffering here in this passage than he does when he talks about the expiatory suffering of Christ. Difference between, pardon my pronunciation, the Greek word thlipsis and pathemata. But still, it's up to us to work this out. How can we look at it? Father Schreiter summarizes 5 main interpretations of Colossians chapter 1, verse 24. And I'm not going to summarize them for you. I will let you read them on your own. What I would like to point out are 2 different things that seem to be most important to precious blood spirituality. And one is under the big title, Suffering with the Members of Christ's Body. The sufferings of all the baptized are the sufferings of Christ. This is important in the face of persecution, a solidarity in suffering between that of believers and that of Christ. Now, it's very important not to cut off those who suffer from those who do not. An example, avoiding people with a terminal disease, avoiding people that have had a mental breakdown, or like I experienced here quite a bit, avoiding people who live in nursing homes. Father Schreiter goes on to say, solidarity in suffering does not mean we experience exactly the same pain as those who suffer. Solidarity does not reproduce the suffering of others, but instead is a deep affirmation of their human dignity, even when it is threatened with disintegration by the onslaught of pain. Our identity isn't what we suffer from. We are not our diseases. We are not what we're called to be as Christians if we label others by what they endure. This suffering is important because it's connected to Christ's suffering in a special way. As Tertullian once said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. A lot of converts didn't see Christ suffer, but they did see the martyrs suffer in public arenas, and paradoxically chose to embrace the same faith that led them to lay their lives down so willingly. Suffering is drawn into the redemptive suffering of Christ, and it can lead to building up a community of faith. The last big section is entitled Suffering with the Head of the Church. Christ's ministry was opposed on earth, so the work of his followers will be opposed as well. It's a sign that there will be setbacks in our work. They are part and parcel of the growth of the church. Disappointment, vulnerability, struggle. Yes, we are on a road to glory, but every way is not a step of glory. The suffering of Christ on the cross was a beginning, making the suffering of his followers healing and redemptive as well. Suffering isn't certain destruction. Christ's sufferings invite us to conform our suffering to his. Father Schreiter says, Christ's shedding of his blood on the cross marks the end of his earthly ministry. It represented an endpoint beyond which he could not go in his preaching and healing activity. But it also came to represent a beginning, a redemptive act that would make the suffering of those who followed after Christ healing and redemptive as well. Suffering no longer meant certain distraction. Another side was revealed. And in the struggle for justice in an unjust world, in the proclamation of good news, or only bad news is being heard, the suffering of Christ invites us to conform our suffering to his own. Our discipleship and ministry is not forgotten, even when those around us may not acknowledge it. Including this study on Colossians 1:24, Father Schreiter gives us a great insight of how this verse can offer precious blood spirituality so much. He says, basically, it helps establish how we, in our suffering, can participate in the ministry and saving action of Christ. It gives meaning to struggle for solidarity and suffering, and it provides consolation and comfort for desolate moments in ministry. In this way, it is different from other elements of spirituality of the blood of Christ, which might emphasize instead how we are recipients of God's great love. That is by no means denied here. Rather, Colossians chapter 1, verse 24 invites us to participate more directly in that saving activity. And living in a world where injustice calls Christians to be participants in struggle rather than distant observers, in the world where suffering and pain threaten to isolate individuals and communities, Such an invitation to participation is deeply needed. And when the suffering we have freely assumed and solidarity begins to dim our own sensibilities, we can turn to the one whose suffering makes ours redemptive and know that what we do in solidarity is not play acting. It is completing what has begun in the sufferings of Christ. There's more we can say about this chapter of In Water and in Blood, and will be said soon. Next Tuesday, we're going to release a video here at this very same place where we're going to expand on some of the things I talked about here. I'll be joined by a couple of other folks, one person very familiar to you all, and somebody new to us, new to our spirituality. Very excited about this conversation. And you can join the conversation as well. Please feel free to leave comments in the comments section below, or to contact us if you have something more extensive to say, or if you have an insight that you think we need to be aware of. So in the meantime, may God bless you, may God give you peace, and may we all find redemption in the precious blood of Christ.